no century would be complete without conflict.
Conflict between the Chinese and the Europeans during the 18th and 19th century was largely caused by the massive cultural difference that arose between the two empires.
Today we will be discussing the primary conflict between Britain and the Chinese government by analyzing primary sources that were written in during the Opium War, a time of both economic and cultural conflict. The Opium War was a series of wars that followed conflicts of Chinese and British economic interests. To put it shortly, the British were selling drugs. The Chinese didn't like it, but the British didn't like the Chinese not liking it, so they go to war.
But of course the causes of the war go much farther back, and tensions that led up to the war had its roots much deeper than a drug deal.
The Chinese and the British tensions first began during a time of European imperialism in the early 1700s. When the Chinese heard about the British Raj and the English sovereignty in India, there began to be tensions and fears that Britain will do the same with China.
When the McCartney mission arrived in China, the emperor's worst fear came true. Here is where we encounter our first primary document.
The Emperor Qianlong wrote a letter to King George III of England, detailing his reason for rejecting the McCartney proposal and also conveying a message that was of much controversy at the time.
In his letter, written in 1793, preceded the Opium War by nearly half a century. It caused much tension between the British and the Chinese that exploded into an all-out war in the 19th century.
Cultural differences were the language barrier but served as a little problem to the king and emperor. Dress was also seen as an issue for cultural difference pointed out in this following excerpt. Suppose that your envoy should come to our court. His language and national dress differ from that of our people, and there would be no place in which to bestow him.
Qianlong also points out in his letter that our ceremonies and code of laws differ so completely from your own, showing massive political and social differences between the two nations.
One key cultural difference seen in this document would be the difference in beliefs in foreign policy. The document states that such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce.
This is a fine example of the conflict of ideology of the two nations, as Britain had more mercantilist and capitalist belief and believed in expansion and profit from overseas, seeking profit from outside nations by all means possible. China's beliefs were the opposite. The Europeans, or rather all outsiders, are viewed in this document in a derogatory manner.
For example, Qianlong said that the Europeans were desperate and needy when it said, "But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which the Celestial Empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, but not only this, but also called barbarians, barbarian tribes, myriad races, lonely, remote, ignorant, etc."
This viewed the Europeans in a very negative light, and probably was not to the liking of the Europeans. But in the eyes of Qianlong, the Chinese were viewed in a much brighter light.
The Chinese were the Celestial Empire at Canton. The Celestial Empire possessed all things in prolific abundance and lacked no product within its own borders. This meant that the empire was viewed as if they were the children of heaven, which at the time was a popular belief.
The Chinese were also described as benevolent to all, to have a perfect governance and possessing majestic virtue. It was almost as if the Chinese were worshipping themselves.
As to bias in the document, there was undisputed bias. The emperor was arrogant in terms of foreign affairs and trade relations, and many believed his thought bubble was that China was in the center of the world. Historians argue that his archaic point of view hindered modernization and industrial advancement in China.
But the outside of Qianlong's seemingly arrogant syntax and prose, there were many records which recorded Qianlong issuing documents to his military generals to guard against British attacks, as if he knowing that his arrogance in the letter would provoke the British.
Qianlong was not ignorant to foreign affairs. Rather, he was extremely well versed in foreign affairs, and seeing that Bengal had been taken by Britain, wrote this letter as a strategic move to prevent further British dominance in China.
The cultural differences did not necessarily lead to conflict. Rather, these tensions of Qianlong rejecting McCartney and British foreign attempts at integration led to the British using unorthodox methods to derive a profit from the stubborn nation.
Unorthodox methods such as selling the highly addictive drug opium From the actions of Qianlong and the contents of this letter, tensions increased, and British merchants began their economic conquest of China. Now the Opium War is about to begin. It started when the British East India Company started selling opium in China and sold it to Chinese merchants, having lost the Indian market.
In 1939, the Commissioner of Canton wanted to cut off all opium trade from Britain, but the British refused to do so because the money that came from the opium was used to buy luxury goods that are in high demand in Britain.
China became a nation of druggies, and when the Chinese declared war, they sent out a small army of junks to fight the British. But the British meet them with a powerful army of modern navy. The British won. But before all this, we must discuss our other primary sources.
Lin policy of caution and his estimate of Great Britain military strength. In 1839, the commissioner for Canton said above was a man called Lin Su. He was opposed to the Opium War despite popular opinion in China.
The cultural differences listed in the document he wrote were similar to the differences listed in the letter from Qianlong, where clothing and language were pointed out. Also, their legs are firmly bound with cloth, and consequently, it is extremely inconvenient for them to stretch. Should they come on land, it is apparent that they can do still less.
The Europeans were viewed by the Chinese as incompetent, as seen by the quote above, but are also viewed as a dominant naval power. Because our vessels are sturdy and our cannons fierce, they call her powerful.
Also, the Europeans were viewed as barbarians who did not know how to use their fists and swords, showing that there was some distance between the Europeans and Asians.
The Asians, on the other hand, were viewed as skillful because they had the ability to use swords and fists to fight, rather than the British using their cannons and large ships. But since this is an estimate of opponent power, there are little descriptions of Asians in this document.
There is definite bias in this document due to the fact that the Chinese commissioner Lin Su kept calling the British barbarians, a similar motive to the other document.
The immense bias cannot necessarily be a good measure of the facts, but can provide insight into what the Chinese believed about the barbarians.
The Treaty of Nanjing came right after the end of the First Opium War.
Written by the British government, the Treaty of Nanjing lists multiple cultural and belief conflicts.
Cultural differences listed in the Treaty of Nanjing are as follows. The Chinese isolationism was not benefiting the British as much as it could, and therefore the British forced their way into the massive and growing Chinese economy.
Because it was a treaty, there was not as many cultural differences, but it showed the writer's subconscious language.
The Europeans here are viewed, or rather are written, as the sovereign and powerful leaders of the Chinese and the government, and were given massive economic and social respect.
While at the same time, the Chinese were a people group who had no choice but to give in the demands of the Europeans. They were viewed as a lower in rank, and they had to listen to the Europeans for they had lost in the Opium War.
As to bias in the document, there is some, as the treaty was written in a very authoritative tone, and as if there were kings of the world.
As a contrary to the previous document, this document can be used for more explicit information, and has little revelation of bias and point of view.
The last document that will be introduced is another letter, introduced by me. The final document was a letter from the same guy, Lin Su, but this time the letter was written by Queen Victoria. This letter concerned the opium trade and the harmful effects that it brought to China. This letter was written right before the Opium War and it detailed the Emperor's plea with the Queen. The letter, though written by Lin, was actually commissioned by the Emperor, intended not only for the British, but the British merchants, etc. Cultural differences mentioned in the piece were that Britain, despite knowing that consumption of opium was bad, was willing to sell the opium to the Chinese. Here the Europeans were viewed as immoral and unethical, while Lin was portraying himself as being on the moral high ground. The Chinese collectively were portrayed as drug addicts who had no lives outside the opium that they smoked. There was some bias, but as a letter of complaint, the bias was more so that the heavy focus of on the selling of opium would be lifted for the sake of the morale of the Chinese population. Lin wanted the Queen to reflect on her ethics, and whether what she was doing was actually okay. To sum it up, there were 4 cultural differences that we covered: clothing, language, politics, and ideology. These conflicts and differences did not immediately polarize the two nations into conflict, but rather, over the years pulled at each other until one day the tension between the two countries snapped, causing an all-out conflict called the Opium War. And that's basically an overall summary of the cultural clash that occurred during the opium war.